animals, hello! Hey! This is Story Shamans! This week we'll be discussing Cubby number 11, Narrative. What do we mean when we say narrative? We mean the structural aspects of how you tell your story. A story is a sequence of events, and your narrative, Cubby, is concerned with how these events are organized and delivered to an audience. We'll get into the what of these story events in later videos all about plot. But for now, here in the narrative, Cubby, it's all about the how of telling your story. There are many factors to consider in the organizing of a narrative. How many plots, how many stories are we telling in the main narrative? What are your narrative's traits? What's your timeline? Do you have a storyteller? Most stories have one or two plots. There's the main plot, or the A plot, and then there's the B plot. It's also possible to have a C or D plot as well. The more plots you have, the less time they have for their telling. And with less time, the less significant they tend to become. It's like a hierarchy, with the most important story at the top with the most time, and the rest in descending order of importance underneath it. Narrative traits! Now the most important narrative traits to consider are perspective, scope, and stakes. Perspective refers to the view from which you'll be telling your story. Does the story unfold from the main character's perspective? From the supporting characters? Or from the audience's perspective? Like a fly on the wall. And then there's the scope of your story. Will we see these events play out on a global scale, rippling across nations like an epic disaster film? Or is the scope very intimate? Just these three people isolated in a bar talking about their feelings. Then there are your stakes. How important are the events? Is your character fighting for the fate of the free world? Or trying to get their car in working order for a date later that night? If you can, always go for higher stakes. This doesn't mean all your stories have to be about global warfare. It means whatever the actual events of your story are, they should be earth-shatteringly important to your characters. Maybe that date later tonight will introduce him to the love of his life. Moving on to timeline! Now the vast majority of stories are linear, following a forward progression of beginning, middle, and end. But there are also non-linear timelines, where the story jumps around at different points in the chronological sequence of events. Think Pulp Fiction or Man of Steel. A familiar way of using non-linear techniques is the flashback, jumping back to previous points in time in a story. Or there's the flash forward, where you briefly jump to a future point in the story's progression. The film 500 Days of Summer did a lot of this. There are also techniques to compress your timeline. This is typically achieved through a montage. The audience experiences brief bits and pieces in quick succession of a larger period of time. You could also have multiple timelines running concurrently. Say you simultaneously follow your character when he's 20 years old and when he's 70 years old. And at some point the two intersect and tie everything together, like in The Notebook. If you're gonna do a non-linear story of any kind, you need an anchor. A point in time that's considered the present. This gives your audience a reference point, so they can keep track of past, present, and future. This anchor could be a person, or a place, or any other differentiating attribute available to you in your story. In Forrest Gump, the anchor was Forrest sitting on that bench at the bus stop. In that case, the anchor was the narrative's storyteller. A storyteller can be a great anchor. We'll discuss storytellers in detail next week when we continue our discussion of narrative.